All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be tackling something that's really, really important, especially I think if you're maybe just starting out in the world of product development.
Yeah.
And that is really like, what does it mean to be a good product owner?
Yeah, absolutely.
And we're going to be taking a look at agile product ownership in a nutshell.
Mm-hmm.
And in this PDF, they talk a lot about this product owner named Pat.
Yeah.
And so we're going to be kind of using Pat as a way to kind of dive into this, but also we'll be extracting just the principles that they're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea here is that we can cut through all the noise and just give you a real clear picture, a clear understanding of what a new product owner needs to focus on to be effective.
Right. So think of it as like your guide to the mindset, the actual practicalities of being a product owner. We're not just going to be like, okay, here's the definition. It's more like what actually makes a difference, what we're seeing from past journey, but also from the principles that are underlined in the source.
Okay. So one of the very first things that they talk about is this idea of the core vision.
Yeah.
And they introduce us to Pat, and this is central to Pat.
Mm-hmm.
But what's interesting about Pat is that, you know, we all have ideas,
Right.
but Pat's really focused on the why.
Exactly.
That, like, what is the underlying problem that they're trying to solve?
Yeah.
And crucially, who are they solving this for?
Exactly.
You know, it's less about all the little tiny details and the features at the beginning. It's more about that overall vision.
Yeah. I think as well, something to add there is that when you're starting out, you know, as a product owner, it's easy to feel that pressure to come in and immediately define like, okay, what are all the bells and whistles? But actually, like you said, Pat's example highlights that if you have that why nailed down, it almost becomes the compass for you.
Yeah.
You know, why are we doing this? It's all about the user, their pain points, really understanding them. And then that brings us into, you know, stakeholders as well. You know, these are individuals who are impacted by the product, right? And I think with Pat, the goal is that the stakeholders don't just use the system, they actually love the system.
Yeah, they genuinely value it.
Exactly.
So you have this vision,
Mhm.
and you also have these stakeholders. They have their needs.
Yeah.
So how do you translate that vision into something that the development team can actually start building?
Yeah.
And so what they talk about in the source is this idea of user stories.
Yes.
And user stories are essentially a bite-sized description of what a user needs to be able to do.
Mhm.
Like, for example, in a flight booking system.
Yeah.
You might have a user story like, as a user, I want to be able to filter search results by price
Yes.
so that I can find the most affordable option.
Perfect.
Right. And Pat is like right in the thick of this, taking those big ideas,
Mm-hmm.
those stakeholder needs,
Yeah.
and turning them into these actionable user stories.
Yeah, exactly. And I think what's really fascinating about Pat's role here is almost like she's a translator, right?
Wow, yeah.
Because you're going to have stakeholders who are coming to you and maybe they just have these really, really broad needs, you know, something like, oh, we need better reporting, you know?
Yeah.
And then Pat's skill is to ask, okay, why? What's behind that request?
Yeah.
And really distill that into those user stories,
Yeah.
right? Those actionable steps that the team can actually understand,
Mhm.
you know? And then from those user stories, they can start to estimate, okay, how long is it going to take to deliver this? And I think for you as well, starting out, you know, mastering that art of crafting those clear user stories that are actually, you know, value driven is kind of a cornerstone of being a product owner.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah.
So you have all these user stories, and then, you know, Pat undoubtedly experiences this.
Yeah.
You have this finite development team.
Right?
They can only do so much.
Exactly. Yeah.
The source talks about this idea of maybe 4 to 6 stories per week
Mhm.
that a team can really handle.
Yeah.
But of course, the stakeholders might have, you know, way more than that they want built.
Yeah. Their enthusiasm might be, you know, 10 stories a week.
Right. So then you run into this potential for overflow.
Yeah, exactly.
What happens if you try to push 10 stories,
Yeah.
you know, into a 4 to 6 story pipeline?
Mm-hmm.
What happens?
I mean, think about it like this, right? They actually have some really, really good analogies in the source.
Yeah.
It's like imagine trying to force too many pages through a printer
Yep.
or too many cars onto a single lane road, right?
Yeah.
The system's going to grind to a halt
Yeah.
and the team's going to end up doing too much. They're going to be multitasking, which, again, counterintuitively, it reduces their efficiency.
Yeah.
They're going to become demotivated. The quality's going to suffer. The output's going to suffer. And it's a recipe for frustration all around.
Yeah. So then what are some effective ways
Yeah.
to manage this? There's always going to be more requests than you can handle.
Exactly. Yeah.
And the source talks about, in Scrum, they talk about yesterday's weather,
Yeah.
where you look back and say, okay, well, the team got this much done last week.
Right. Yeah.
So that's probably what they can get done this week.
Yeah.
And then in Kanban, you have this idea of limiting work in progress.
Yeah.
So you just put a cap on how many stories the team is actively working on.
Exactly. I think both of those strategies that they mentioned there really, really help with establishing that sustainable rhythm for the team.
Yeah.
Because if you prevent that overload from happening, you allow the team to focus, and ultimately, it leads to better quality, more consistent delivery. And, all this work is then organized into what's called a product backlog, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Which is essentially a list of everything that could be done, and it's prioritized.
Yeah, like the queue.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the queue.
The queue of work. And speaking of prioritizing,
Yeah.
we have to talk about a word that the source really stresses, especially for someone who's just starting out, is critical.
Yeah.
And that word is no.
It's a powerful word.
It's such a powerful word.
Yeah.
It's so easy to say yes.
It is.
It's like, oh yeah, we can add that to the backlog.
Yeah, let's just chuck it in there. Yeah.
But really the skill here,
Mhm.
and I think it's often the biggest hurdle for people,
Yeah.
is deciding what not to build.
Right. And that's where you actually shape the product.
Yes.
You're managing expectations as well.
Yeah.
And I think going back to what we talked about at the beginning, the clarity of that vision,
Yeah.
if you have that, saying no isn't being obstructive.
Right.
It's more about saying, okay, I'm trying to make sure that we stay focused on what matters.
Yeah.
And it takes courage, right?
Yeah.
Especially when you're new, to be able to say no to a stakeholder who's maybe really, really enthusiastic about something.
Yeah.
But I mean, a product owner who can't say no is going to end up with a backlog that's just completely out of control, you know?
Yeah.
The team's going to be overwhelmed. It's not good.
Okay, so you have this backlog.
Mm-hmm.
You're saying no when you need to.
Yeah.
How do you decide what gets bumped up the list?
Yeah, good question.
Right? How do you prioritize?
Yeah.
And they point to two really big things.
Mm-hmm.
You have to consider the value that a story will deliver,
Yes.
but then you also have to consider the size,
Yeah.
right? The effort it's going to take to actually implement it.
Right, exactly.
And they kind of debunk a myth here, which is that bigger doesn't always mean better.
Yeah, bigger doesn't always mean more important.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
You might have a really small, straightforward feature
Mm-hmm.
that delivers immense value.
Yeah.
And you might have this really complex thing that takes forever to build. That, in the end, maybe isn't that important.
Yeah. And I think they had a good example where they compared, two stories that were relatively similar in size, but they were massively different in the value that they offered.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really good illustration of how you should be thinking, okay, well, this is the same effort, but which one is going to deliver more? And clearly, you're going to go with the one that offers more value.
Yeah. Now, of course, figuring out the exact value and the exact size,
Yeah.
it's not an exact science.
Right. There's no calculator for it.
Yeah. The source calls it a guessing game.
Yeah, I love that.
But Pat's in this constant dialogue with stakeholders,
Mm-hmm.
to understand what truly is valuable.
Yeah.
But then also Pat's talking to the team
Right.
to get their best estimations of effort.
Right. And also, it's important to remember that those are estimates, right?
Yeah.
We're not talking about, precise calculations. It's more like, if you were to compare, okay, do I prefer an apple or a strawberry? It's very much in the moment.
Yeah.
It's subjective, right? And I think a key point they make in the source is that the real benefit isn't in trying to get those initial guesses, absolutely perfect.
Yeah.
The real benefit is the conversations that those estimations spark.
Yeah.
Because, you're having these discussions and you start to unearth, okay, what are the assumptions that we're making, right? It helps everyone get on the same page about what's actually important.
Yeah.
And, plus our understanding evolves, right? As we start to deliver things, we get feedback from users, and that's why doing it continuously is so much more effective than trying to just, nail everything down at the very beginning.
Yeah. When you have the least amount of information.
Exactly. Yeah.
And we're also talking about, delivering value frequently.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just about prioritizing. It's about breaking those larger stories down into smaller pieces.
Exactly. Yeah.
Bite-sized pieces, as they say in the sauce.
Yeah. Bite size. So I mean, ideally, you'd want a story to be small enough that it can be completed in a few days,
Yeah.
right? And then you have that nice funnel shape to your backlog,
Yeah.
where the stuff at the top, really clear stories, well-defined, and then as you go further down, maybe things are a little bit more ambiguous.
Yeah.
And, that refinement as well happens just in time.
Yeah.
So as you learn more, you can break things down,
Yeah.
so you're not wasting effort on, defining things that might change later.
Yeah. So all of this, estimating, prioritizing, splitting these stories, this all kind of falls under the umbrella of backlog grooming.
Yeah, exactly.
And in the source, they give us an example of how Pat facilitates these regular backlog grooming workshops.
Yeah.
Maybe it's, a 1-hour meeting every week.
Yeah.
With the team.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes stakeholders are there.
Yeah, keep it regular. Yeah.
Yeah. And this really helps to keep that backlog healthy.
It does, yeah.
And actionable.
Yeah. It gives the team that dedicated time to ask those questions. Okay, can you clarify this? What do you mean by that? Stakeholders can also contribute, offer additional context, and the product owner can just make sure that everyone's on the same page.
Mm-hmm.
And crucially, I think as well, it's during these sessions that you define what's called acceptance criteria.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Which is basically, okay, how do we know that the story is done?
Yeah.
It needs to meet these conditions.
Yeah. So we've kind of explored this role.
Yeah.
And I think there's a really clear theme that's emerged.
It's all about communication, right?
Yeah. I mean, the source really underscores that product ownership at its core is about communication.
Yeah.
They talk about how experienced product owners, they always emphasize passion, but they also emphasize communication.
Right. It's those two things together.
Yeah. And it's interesting, they even connect this back to the first principle of the Agile Manifesto, which is individuals and interactions.
Right.
Over processes and tools.
Exactly, yeah.
And so really, the product owner isn't just a requirements gatherer, right?
No. They're a hub.
Yeah, they're like a hub.
They're fostering that understanding.
Yeah.
They're making sure everyone's aligned, the team, the stakeholders. And again, going back to Pat, her role isn't to come in and dictate solutions or to micromanage the team.
Yeah.
It's about making sure that everyone understands that big picture, that vision that we talked about, making sure that the team has direct access to stakeholders. So if they need clarification, they can just go directly to the source.
Yeah.
Right?
And then also making sure that you have that feedback loop, through frequent releases, and that empowers the team to actually make decisions daily.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. It frees up Pat's time so they can think a bit more strategically.
Yeah. And this interaction leads to trade-offs.
Yeah.
There's always going to be trade-offs.
Right.
And the source points to a few key ones.
Yeah.
And I think these are really, really important for a new product owner to be aware of.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So the first one is this balance between knowledge value and customer value.
Yeah.
So early on in a project,
Yeah.
when there's a lot of uncertainty, you might really need to focus on things that reduce risk,
Right.
things that help you increase understanding.
Yeah.
So this might be things like building prototypes or maybe doing some technical spikes to explore different approaches.
Right. Yeah.
So these might not be things that directly result in, customer-facing features, but they provide essential learning,
Yeah.
right? And then as you move through the project
Yeah.
and that uncertainty diminishes, then the focus kind of shifts more towards, okay.
Let's actually deliver.
Yeah.
Yeah. Give the customers what they want.
Yeah.
And I think what's really key there is, understanding that value isn't always what the customer immediately sees.
Right.
Sometimes it's about, investing in reducing technical risk or even validating a key assumption that we have.
Yeah.
And that's the most valuable thing you can do in the short term, to pave the way for delivering that actual customer value later down the line.
Yeah.
Another big one is this idea of short-term versus long-term thinking, right? You're always balancing, do we fix this bug right now?
Yeah.
Do we build this new feature?
Yeah.
Or do we upgrade this platform,
Yeah.
in a way that's really essential that might not be visible to the user?
Yeah. And this is where you need to have that strategic perspective,
Yeah.
right? Even when you're starting out as a product owner, you need to be able to zoom out. Look at the long-term, okay, what's the long-term viability of this product? If we ignore technical debt, which is basically what happens when you prioritize speed over quality,
right. Yeah.
It comes back to bite you later.
Yeah.
So you need to make sure you're investing in the platform so it can grow.
Yeah.
Otherwise you're going to hinder innovation down the line.
And then we have this one, which I think we hear all the time.
Yeah.
Build the right thing.
Yeah.
Build the thing right.
Yeah.
Build it fast.
Right. And ideally, we want all three.
Ideally, but that's the sweet spot, isn't it?
It is. Yeah. It is.
Like,
yeah.
if you spend too much time trying to be perfect too early on,
right,
you might miss your window.
Yeah.
But if you rush it out there,
yeah, it's
going to be buggy.
Right.
And you're going to have a lot of technical debt.
Right. Yeah.
And if you build a really technically brilliant feature,
yeah,
but no one needs it,
right,
well, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, it doesn't matter at all.
So how do you navigate this?
Yeah, good question. I mean, again, going back to the source, they highlight the importance of a short feedback loop.
Yeah.
Right? So if you're delivering frequently, gathering feedback from your users, you're going to get a much better understanding of, okay, what is the right thing and how do we build it right?
Yeah.
So it meets their needs, but also in a way that's sustainable.
Yeah.
And
then one more, I think, especially for product owners who are, maybe in an organization that has existing products.
Yeah.
You also have to balance new product development with improving old products.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so a lot of times a team might be responsible for both.
Right.
And so then the product owner has to manage a backlog that has both of these things in it.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting trade-off too.
It is, yeah. And it's about understanding, the strategic priorities.
Yeah.
Okay, what are the goals for each product? And then making those tough decisions. Where do we allocate the resources?
Yeah. So you have all these trade-offs.
Yeah.
Now, a really big part of the product owner's role, especially when you're working with stakeholders who are naturally very invested in seeing their ideas implemented, is expectation management.
Right.
Okay. And in the source, they really stress being realistic and truthful. No lying, they say.
I love that.
Right. So when a stakeholder asks, okay, well, when is this going to be done? I'm going to deliver.
Yeah.
You need to give them honest answers.
Yeah.
And you need to use data to inform your answer.
Exactly.
And so what they talk about is this tool called a story burn-up chart.
Yeah.
Which is essentially a way to track the cumulative number of stories delivered over time.
Yeah. It's a good visualization.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think what's really, really important here is to understand the difference between output, which is the number of stories, and outcome, which is the actual results achieved, the level of satisfaction of the stakeholders.
Right. You're not just churning out features.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
You're trying to deliver the right features that lead to positive outcomes.
Yeah. You want to do it in the most efficient way possible.
Yeah. Less is more.
Yeah.
You know? And the burn-up chart helps with that because it shows you, okay, what's the trend? What's our velocity?
Yeah.
And that allows you to forecast.
Yeah. So you can start answering those questions, those typical questions that stakeholders ask.
Yeah.
Like, well, we have this fixed scope. When will this be done?
Yeah.
Or we have this fixed time.
Yeah.
How much can we get done? Or even we have this fixed time and we have this fixed scope.
Yeah.
Can you answer that honestly?
Right. Yeah.
And I think it's really interesting. They say, it's generally better to try to reduce scope than extend the delivery timeline.
Yeah. It's about getting something out there quickly. That's valuable.
Yeah.
Rather than delaying and delaying and delaying.
And using real data for these forecasts.
Yeah.
It really builds trust with stakeholders.
It does, yeah.
It's much better to be upfront about any uncertainty, present realistic possibilities, rather than just making promises you can't keep.
Right. It's about being honest.
Yeah.
And that fosters a more collaborative environment. Stakeholders are going to understand you more.
Yeah. And I think they also really stress this idea of maintaining a sustainable pace for the development team.
Yeah.
Right. So if the team cuts corners on testing, if they're not paying attention to the architecture, they're going to accumulate this technical debt.
Right.
And then that will slow them down.
Yeah.
And then it makes forecasting really, really difficult.
Yeah.
So the product owner needs to be able to support the team.
Yeah.
Help them prioritize code quality.
Yeah.
Make sure that they're not just doing things quickly just to meet the deadline.
Exactly.
Make sure they're doing things sustainably.
A healthy code base is so important.
Right.
If you invest in that,
it
leads to faster and more reliable delivery later down the line.
Yeah, yeah. And finally, to kind of briefly touch on larger projects where you might have multiple development teams.
Right.
And of course, then you're going to have multiple product owners.
Yeah.
And while all the principles we've talked about still apply.
They do.
Right? You still need to manage capacity. You need to communicate. You need to say no.
Yeah.
You need to groom that backlog.
Yeah.
Keep that feedback loop.
Yeah.
There's also this added layer of coordination.
Right.
Right. So the product owners need to talk to each other.
They do, yeah.
They need to manage dependencies between the teams.
Yeah.
They need to make sure that, one team isn't optimizing at the expense of the other.
Yeah.
And they even talk about this concept of a chief product owner to kind of synchronize everything.
Yeah, all about communication, right?
Yeah.
Making sure those product owners are talking to each other.
Yeah. So we're coming to the close of this deep dive into the agile product owner role.
Yeah.
If you're just starting out, I think, these are really the essential takeaways.
Yeah.
You need to have a clear vision, right? The why. You need to understand your stakeholders.
Right.
You need to prioritize. And you need to say no.
Yeah.
You need to be constantly learning. You need to communicate.
Yeah.
And you need to be aware of the trade-offs.
Yeah. I think as well, one of the biggest pieces of advice I would give to someone who's starting out is, just recognize that it is a journey. You're going to make mistakes.
Yeah.
You're going to learn.
Yeah.
So just keep asking questions. Ask for feedback.
Yeah.
And be prepared to adapt.
Yeah.
As you gain more experience.
Yeah. That's a great way to put it. And I think, one final thought. Just think about all the products.
Yeah.
The digital products
right.
that you interact with every day.
Yeah.
And think about, there's a product owner.
Yeah.
Behind every one of those.
Right.
Making decisions.
Yeah.
What trade-offs did they have to make?
Yeah.
They had to balance innovation and features
with
stability